about 4 years ago, just almost to this day, we had a program right here in this spot, and George Carpenter gave it. Donna posted a photo of this, of the group. We all assembled up here. There were 17 of us. And George gave a presentation on the history of the Monon that day. And looking back at that, I realized that's what kind of changed the tenor of our programs. That's set the form for everything was to follow, because George had a projector, and he sat down there, and he had a laptop, and we've used that format ever since, PowerPoint presentations. So I kind of want to call the point before George spoke as AG, or BG, before George. And then all that came after, we call, of course, AG, after George. So 4 years after George, we're into this. Oh, and also, David Lemon has a couple of remarks to make real quick.
Real quick. Hello. I'm David. I'm David Lemon. I volunteer at the Monroe County History Center. I don't know if any of you saw the guest column in the HT yesterday regarding the 50th anniversary of the Rose Bowl team. As Bob Hamill said, we talk about the Rose Bowl team, and other colleges say the 72 Rose Bowl team or the 78 Rose Bowl team. All we say is the Rose Bowl. Anyway, to commemorate this anniversary, on September 23rd at the History Center, 9 a.m. It's early because I think there's a football game that day. Free coffee and treats. And what we are trying to do is bring memories of Bloomingtonians mostly of that year, what they remember and so on. If you'd like to go in early to the History Center and make a recording, we can manage that too. So anyway, that will be fun, I think. And we may even have some still living players come in, so hopefully there's a few of those. And secondly, over here on the table, the History Center is sponsoring a trip, a day trip, September September 16th. It's an all-day trip, and it's for James Whitcomb Riley. It goes to his home, the museum, out to eat at Rathskeller's on U. This is the last week to sign up for the trip, and it's $75 this week only. $85 usually, but this is the last week. Megan and AJ from the History Center are here. If you have any questions, they'll be happy to speak to you. So that was long enough. Anyway, there's a sign-up sheet over here too.
Thanks, David. Now, George is going to make a few comments. George, I call my minister of propaganda. He's the one that sends out all the emails and stuff, but got a few comments.
That's among the other things he calls me. Today he was very nice to me because his computers didn't work, and he was on the hard team. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your being here. Our attendance seems to get larger every time. How many of you have been here before? Have not been here before. For those of you who have, how many did not receive an email to this presentation? Okay, I need to see. Yes, dear. What? I need to see you after this presentation. Get your email address straight. We have another technological blunder. Yahoo managed to combine my Monroe County history list, my Monon Railroad list, and my personal list all into one great big, over 1,000 people file. And after my eyes uncrossed, I did the best I could to resurrect it and bring it back to life. But let everything work. So if you let me know, I'd be glad to put your name down the list. Kudos, thank yous to cats. You make a lot possible for us by letting us put our presentations on YouTube. Every presentation we've done after my Monon presentation has been on YouTube, I believe, at least most of it were.
Since November 2000.
Yeah. Once again, always thank you to the Legion. Please be as generous as you can to our servers. They do a good job for us. It's a good meal. Do any of you have any comments, criticisms for the good of the cause? And thank you very much for being here. I'll turn this back to Mike.
Thank you, George.
Here's a little rundown of some future programs. September 26th, we've got Bob Hamill. I was mentioned this before, the retired sports editor for the HT and a pretty well-known guy around here. He's going to give a program of the great local pioneer black athletes from Monroe County, like George Shively, George Talifero, Bill Garrett, and others. I've seen this. He gave this at the History Center, and it's an excellent program. October 31st, Dave Williams of the Parks Department will give a program on the history of Cascades Park, and we'll also look into the histories of our other parks, like Bryant Park, what used to be called 3rd Street Park, Building and Trades Park, and some others. Then November 28th, we had originally had Brad Cook scheduled from IU to finish up his History of IU program, but as things happen sometimes, he had some conflict, so he won't be able to make it. So I was lucky enough to get a guy, Jeremy Boshears, who's really studied the history of covered bridges a lot. And this should really be fascinating to most people. It's a history of the covered bridges of the state of Indiana. So there we are through November 28th. We don't know about December yet, but we'll figure out something. Now, today we introduced local historian Dan Combs. Dan has been is it Perry Township trustee? Yeah, for a long time. And he taught at both Bloomington South and Ivy Tech. He's going to discuss the Great Spanish Flu pandemic and its effects on our area as it swept through here almost 100 years ago. It's very fascinating stuff, and me being an ex-pharmacist, retired pharmacist, it's fascinating to me. He'll also discuss the local public health responses to other diseases of the day, like cholera, smallpox, typhoid. And I told Dan just to think of us as one of his high school classes, only a little bit older, a little bit hard of hearing, so anyway. So Dan, here we go.
Thank you for having me. The technology, I hope, doesn't fail me. I hope. This is my first presentation since I retired from teaching 3 years ago. So we'll just have to see how that goes. The IU Rose Bowl football comment, 20 years ago or so, Eric Stolberg, who was the tight end, or excuse me, yeah, he was the tight end on that team. He was a receiver. And we had kids together in soccer, and we would sit together and watch the games. And I talked to him one day about that season, and he said, you know, my biggest fear is that on the 50th anniversary of that football game, they're going to wheel us out in our wheelchairs. We're going to go out in crutches, limping, holding each other up, and they will announce us as our Rose Bowl team. And he said, I truly hope that doesn't happen. Well, here we are, 150 years, and they're going to announce him as, let us give you our Rose Bowl team. So that was very much on point for the season. I want to say I'm a local boy, but I think I finally got out of boy. I'm from Harrodsburg. I went to Smithville. Someday, hopefully, Phil here in the front row is going to lead a fund drive to put a plaque on Smithville High School that says Dan Combs slept here. And that's how I want to be remembered. I have 3 degrees from IU, and my last one was Masters of History. And instead of doing a thesis, I got to do 5 or 6, depending on how you count, a mini thesis of 35 pages each. And of those, 4 were on Bloomington, Monroe County from 1900 to 1925. And the first one was on the flu. The thing that just tears at me when I'm doing research, in particular in the old newspapers, is I veer off. And I go off and I start reading things that are just tangential. So as we go through this, and the order will be typhoid, smallpox, and then the flu if we get to it, there will be just little deviations, which I hope will keep you awake. It's right after lunch, so I'll try to keep the macabre out of it, although that's what kept my students awake. And I've spent hundreds of hours literally in the microflash archive at Indiana University and the Indiana the Indiana room, Monroe County. Christine Friesel, back here, she's helped me quite a bit, and she responded. I had a computer crash on Friday, and she got me some pictures that I really needed to replace. So with that, I'll just take off, and if you want, anytime you want to ask me a question, please do, because it helps me fill in the time. Hey, there's a lot of issues. There's a pile of issues when you try to put Monroe County history together. We have the 1870 history of Monroe, Brown, Greene County, which you had to pay to get in. So that's really a class-driven history. It's from the top looking down, quarry owners, business people, pharmacists, things like that. I tried to get away from that. So you've got, for the things I like, you've got local boards of health. And this is where it starts getting complicated. There were 3. There was the Bloomington Board of Health, there was the Ellettsville Board of Health, and there was the Monroe County Board of Health, which was supposed to have been the superior of all 3 in the hierarchy. They were supposed to be at the top. County Clerk Jim Fielder and I one day stood and literally wept when the county started hauling records out of the old Allen Funeral Home on 6th Street in dump trucks and taking them off to the landfill. Included in those records we established when I started doing that were the minute books and everything but the death records for Monroe County. So it's really hard to get a look at Monroe County back then. The other part of it is, yes?
I thought by law they were required to keep those records.
Probably. Back then, even though there was a historical society, the county did not, they weren't microflashing, they weren't digitalizing. This was, that was the courthouse annex there at 6th and Washington for 10 years, and no, it just didn't happen. So you got to put things together, but those records just don't exist. And the county health department was kind enough several years ago to let me peruse the death records for this period. I don't think that's going to happen again because of HIPAA laws and concern, but it really helped me understand what it was like to live here if you weren't a quarry owner and if you weren't a business owner and if you were just a lineman at showers or you worked in the quarries. The quarries were essentially butcher yards. The deaths in the quarries were staggering in number and in horror. One of the documents that survives, Michael and I talked about it, is the county coroner records of investigations of unattended deaths or deaths of suspicious nature. And there are just a dozen, 24 county quarry records of people being squashed, decapitated, trapped from the waist down and just had to stay there until they died, things of that nature. And those didn't make it into that 1870-1910 history of those two books because their families could not afford to pay. So I've always been kind of fascinated with that end of it. It wasn't a nice place. The problems with the records that still exist, including those coroner records, is beginning in the 1850s in England, there was a big push to standardize causes of death. So you could just track how many people died of heart attack, how many people died of pneumonia. And in 1900 and 1910, the American Public Health Service actually signed an international treaty that established the nomenclature so we could compare ourselves to the rest of the world. That didn't go over real well in Bloomington. By the time it got here, there were two sets of doctors. One of them were the doctors who went through apprentice and classic Greek education, where literally they still believed in ethers and bleeding and things like that in 1900. And then the other set went to medical universities. And the medical university doctors did their job because they had the language to describe these events. The lay people did not really, they used lay terms. And looking for typhoid, which is a disease of the abdomen, even though this is 10 years after the US was supposed to have standardized our language, you have death by acute gastritis, probably induced by eating green walnuts. Stomach troubles developing into brain fever, acute indigestion, and then dysentery, teething. So to try to come up with any meaningful narrative and data bank, you've really got to read these things and start setting up your own categories and trying to connect them. And I have fun doing that because I was able to put all these stomach ailments together and no one else had. But these are also lines out of that coroner report that give you an idea of exactly how unpleasant it was to not have a white-collar job. Crushed between limestone blocks, decapitated by trains. Enormous number of people went to sleep on the train tracks. It's just there, and it happens, and it happens, and it happens, and I don't know why. Well, alcohol, but it was one of the big surprises was how many people were killed by trains in Bloomington. Trying to beat cars over the crossings was a real regular occurrence too. But then there's electrocution, accidental, a lot of those 1910 to 1925 when electricity was being expanded out into the county. People hooking their electricity directly to the line and not having circuit breaker boxes or anything, and then they grab a live wire and they get 2,000 volts and they fry. That was not unusual at all because it was all a new experience. Homicide, suicide, we still see a lot of those. Drowned in a bucket of water. There's at least 2 instances of that where toddlers flipped over looking into a bucket of water. Shot with this one, and this again is one of those threads that I haven't looked at, but it's very much worth looking at. Shot with a 12-gauge shotgun while stealing watermelons in Gosport. You may not know it, but Gosport and Steinsville were the getaway towns. Gambling, bootleg, women's of vice and ill repute. And this just didn't make sense to me. Did people really steal watermelons? And what it is, I believe, is a cover-up for a murder. An African American who went into Steinsville and Gosport to play cards, and he won. And that was resolved by, he was shot with a shotgun. He came back to Bloomington, and in order to cover the tracks, everybody said, oh, he was stealing watermelons, which is a justifiable homicide. And these notations too inventory what the person had on their body at the time of the death. And nothing of value is the predominant death. So the coroner records that we have, Michael has them, he says, and he's posted them to the list, really are a record of how lower income people died. And it's not the 1910, 1870 histories of Monroe County, Monroe and Lawrence County. It's a very different life. For me, my father worked in the quarries, probably for a lot of you. And that's why I like this era so much, is there's really two different narratives of Bloomington. And the physical conditions were, at a minimum, horrific. We still see the bigger houses we want to put on the historical registries and stuff. Most of them weren't like that. Between East 12th Street, that was the far northern edge, and East 7th Street to Dunn to Lincoln was an area, and it's racist, and I'm sorry, there's just no other name for it. It was called Bucktown. And I touch on that a little bit. And that was just actually hovels dug into the ground. It was people who had worked for the railroad who got laid off in Bloomington. And so they walked off the IC tracks and started digging holes in the old Showers lumber yard. And it was there for about 40 years. And it's one of my favorite stories of Bloomington, because we've just wiped out the memories of that. It's really hard to find any evidence. But 1830s, there was a cholera epidemic in Bloomington. We have shallow wells. We still have shallow wells. I grew up on a well that was 80 foot deep in Harrodsburg, and the only reason I'm here is we gradually were immunized to all the stuff in that. When we pulled the pumps out in my adult life, it was just the most horrific thing you had ever seen. You couldn't see the pumps, just a black, tarry, oozy matter on the pump. And cholera is spread through human waste. So in Bloomington, even though most people were on cisterns by 1900, in the 1830s, wells were how they did it. The outhouses were right above the wells. So when you got one person that came in and the big cholera epidemics in the U.S. in the 1830s, then it went directly into the water supply and it cycled through. But travelers that came through in mid-1830s reported no people at all in Bloomington from this cholera epidemic, that the entire town had fled, including all the students from IU and the faculty. And this is where the beginnings of the story of Indianapolis wanted to move IU because of the water situation come from. And I'm still kind of amazed at that. There's just certain, my grandmother knew everything. She was born in 1908. She knew everything. She never mentioned these living conditions. She just never said, oh yeah, your great-great-grandfather died of cholera here in Bloomington. So 1893, it wasn't the Daily Student then, it was the Indiana Student, complained of the prevalence of typhoid and malarial fever in Bloomington. This was when the push was being taken in Indianapolis to get the university out of Bloomington because it was so unhealthy. And when the inspections were done, there were rotting piles of garbage and waste in the alleyways. There wasn't a sewage collection system installed until the beginnings of 1910. So if you use your imagination on a sunny day and a deep breath of air, most of the people in Bloomington did not have much shelter from the living conditions. And the editorial in the Daily Student that recites these facts called for the university to be moved out of Bloomington, not based on a lack of water, which we've all heard, but based on the sanitary conditions, that piles of rotting garbage, dead animals in the streets. There just was no, it was laissez-faire. Everybody's on their own. So public service came in 1905, they were proposed, and they were given to a committee, which still we see that kind of behavior. 1908, the city council stepped in, took the committee assignment away, and 1910, public sewers were started. They went down not quite to the Winston Thomas, they just went down to Clear Creek, Grimes area in there, and just drained into the creek. But they got them out of downtown. Most of the sewage was still dealt with at the time by vaults. And I know a dozen people in Bloomington who live in the older houses that go, oh, it's really neat. There's a brick cistern out in our backyard from before when they got sewers. Well, no, that's not a cistern. That is the cesspools. Yeah, sorry, I lost that word. And it was well into the 1920s before Bloomington people got on the sewer. They, you know, I mean, my grandparents lived through this, I lived through it. So Bloomington was a fairly nasty place to live, unless you had money, and then you avoided all these places. But the water situation was always bad. We know that. That's one of the standard tales of Bloomington. The hospital, built in 1905, did not get on a sewer system until 1910. So, you know, how do you spread disease? Don't be on a sewer system. And Jordan Starr gave one of the most damning reports on the condition of IU to the state legislature of Bloomington. He was pushing to have it removed. There was only one street paved in the 1890s. The rest were clay. They weren't even gravelled. You couldn't go in a rain. They had limestone blocks just set in the road, and you leap from block to block to get across the streets. And that did not change quickly. And the streets also, though, were the repository of garbage, horse manure piles, pigs. Swine were allowed to run free in Bloomington until the 1920s. And I'm sorry, I know you're eating, but I'm fascinated by this. Yes? How does it, the other Indiana towns? It's very comparative, except for the reliance on well water here. You know, if you go east from here, there's no groundwater. So those towns had to come up, you know, they used surface water, which was probably as bad. But one of the resources, and it's well worth looking at, it's online, are the Board of Health reports for the state of Indiana. It's in the IU archives, and they're monthly magazines, monthly health bulletins. And they would go around and take pictures of the slums and the non-slums. And sometimes it's very hard to tell them apart. So all towns had horrid conditions, but ours were a little bit different in that we have a water table about 80 feet down. And when you're drilling a well, you stop at the first water table. And 80 feet is nothing in a sinkhole. We have sinkholes that are 60 foot deep. So you've got a hole 20 feet. It was lethal. And, you know, my family has been here 6 generations. And so I got bits of this as stories when I was a kid. But my grandmother, they were just, and she was a walking newspaper, you know. Anyone here that's from Kirksville or down around Popcorn, she probably knew the sins of your forebears. But she never talked about how nasty it was unless I asked her. And, you know, this is the reason that pubs, and there was so much drunkenness in 1900 up to Prohibition, is people drank alcohol instead of water. And, you know, if you think about having outhouses in a town of 9,000 people like Bloomington and a water table that's 70 foot deep, you're going to get sick. And after I grew up on a well in Hertzburg, after I went to the military and came back, I could not drink the water. And until my mother passed away in the 1990s, from the 1970s, I did not drink her water in Harrisburg because of this. You know, it's kind of, you get immune to it. But what I couldn't get immune to was the smell. It actually had a very foul smell once I'd gotten away and came back. The 1910, there was 1 mile of pavement in Bloomington, brick streets around the square essentially. And by 1917, 600% increase. 10,000 people and 6 miles of paved streets. These are the county roads. This one's in color. We have 17 acres down by Lake Monroe. We have an old township road that goes through our property, and it's hand-laid stone. And even getting around in Monroe County was an effort. The primary road, the Bloomington to Bedford Pike Road, had been there since the 1820s, but it wasn't paved until well into the 1930s. And then our health infrastructure, and I love this kind of stuff. I mean, it's just so much fun. Bloomington Hospital, I think we all know, 1905. And in 1905, the hospital was where you went for an amputation or to die. That's what it was for. It wasn't to get you better. It was just to give you comfort. There were 9 beds in the hospital. 3 of them were going to be charity beds. And then, and not to read a PowerPoint to you, there were 5 additional beds in outbuildings. And that is where the hospital is now. The charity cases overwhelmed them all the time. There was just so much poverty in Bloomington that the charity beds never were enough. And so on Henderson Street, just north of Templeton School, was the pest house. IU installed it for sick IU students in 1902, I believe. On the west side of Bloomington, somewhere between 2nd and 3rd Street, the old quarry that used to be in there, somewhere in that area was the Bloomington Pest House. And that's where you essentially went, you either went there to die or get better. Those were your 2 options. And it wasn't staffed by medical people, it was staffed by a man and woman who were given their meals and coal to get through the winter. So our health infrastructure was just about as bad as our drinking. The IU Infectious Disease Hospital eventually became a partnership with the city of Bloomington, and there was a couple hired to feed the patients and keep the fire going. Then there was a smallpox epidemic in 1917, and another pest house was organized somewhere down around Country Club and Walnut Street, and Old Walnut Street. Somewhere in that area was a pest house that people who could not afford to stay home with the quarantine were sent down there. And the pest stands for pestilence. The IU pest house was actually called the IU Infectious Disease Hospital, but it was neither a disease nor did IU have very much to do with it. Those are just lost records. Those boards of health and the things that were hauled off, those records no longer exist. They were at one time kept in minute detail, But now they're not decomposing in the landfill. Nothing decomposes in the landfill. But those records just don't exist anymore. The state health officer, a nationally famous figure, his name is Dr. John Hurdy, he became very much famous for advocating lobotomies for the criminally insane and involuntary sterilization. He was a health officer for about 50 years. There's a book called The Hoosier Health Officer about him, and he was cutting edge at the time. He was one of the public health officials in the United States. He showed up at the courthouse one day, right around the turn of the century, 1900, and condemned the well for the courthouse, and the community erupted and said, hey, this is our downtown, get out of here. So he said, watch this. And he pumped some water and said, smell this. And well, it's like nobody could smell it because they were so used to it. So he said, okay. And he went into the courthouse where they had flush toilets and nowhere to go. The sewers weren't in yet. He dumped fluorescent green dye into the toilet and flushed it. And he said, we'll wait 1 hour. And the well that was on the south side of the square, in 1 hour, he pumped a glass of water out of that well, and it was brilliant green. And that was the first courthouse well that was closed. And eventually they're all gone. If you know where they are, I was there for some construction in the 1980s, and on the north side there was a pipe casing that they hit. On the lawn on the east side is a hole that's covered up with a piece of limestone and soil, and that was, you could drop a rock and just never hear it. So those wells were there, and if you didn't have enough money to have your own well, you went to the courthouse and got water.
Yeah, and the really scary thing that we think about, the courthouse is one of the highest points in town. Everything went downhill from there.
Everything went downhill. Limestone leaks, that's why quarry holes have water in them, is the running through. And like I said, I grew up on one of those wells, and I would never drink it today because I get sick. This is the courthouse at the time, and this was taken right at the time of Hertie's experiment, and I kind of miss that building. I wish I'd been here. The source of information for health in Monroe County, they're varied and they're incomplete. That's the best. The archives, State Board of Health put out a monthly magazine. It's online. If you go to Google Books, the whole series of magazines are online, and some of the most fascinating reading for the state of Indiana you can find. This was a horrid place. The death rate in Monroe County in 1900 was around 120 infants out of 1,000 by the time they reached their 5th birthday. The national average had dropped to around 80. In the 1870s, it was over 200 for Monroe County, which is about the level of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, that you got that kind of infant mortality rate. It wasn't a nice place. And again, going to the histories of Monroe County, the 1870s and the 1910s, you only are reading the stories of the people who could afford to pay money to get into those books. So when you start going through these archives, they're just, it was shocking. I mean, I started out with the flu and obviously wandered out all over the place. But you had, the other archives, Bloomington Telephone and Oscar Cravens at the Evening World, who was one of our legendary characters that no one knows anything about. Brad Fute and Cravens had not just a newspaper rivalry, they had a personal conflict and a political conflict. One was Brad Fute was a Republican, Cravens was a Democrat, and the idea was to get the scoop And there are copies of the Evening World where there were 3 editions in one day in Bloomington, just depending on what it was. And the Daily Telephone had almost that kind of regularity, but it's not something that you see. I mean, you have to go look for these. And there's certain years missing once you get to 1920s that cover the really juicy stuff when health became a major concern. Then you also had the Weekly Star, which was a summary of the Evening World. And the Weekly Star was still in existence when I was in high school. There was a weekly paper. My dad used to get it and bring it home, and it was really just full of legal ads. That was the purpose it was there, because if you had a newspaper, the government had to pay you for legal ads. And then History of Indiana University, there's 2 of them, and they're at the Monroe County Library. They are in the IU Library. Who's your health officer? Dr. John Hurdy. And I can't say enough about Dr. Hurdy. He became, public health became an issue in the 1870s. The things we don't realize about public health is that's why women wear short skirts today. So they wouldn't drag them through the streets and the sewage and the muck and bring them into their homes. And the skirts went up. We would like to think it's because she turned a nice ankle, but really it's because the streets were so filthy that if you raised your dress up, you didn't have to do the Southern Belle thing by pulling the hoops up. And then the Monroe County death records, fascinating, and I don't think they're gonna let me do this again. This was 2 health directors ago. They let me go through that death records for about 1900 to 1928. Fascinating. Yes?
When did you say Dr. John Hurdy was in charge?
I want to say 1880 to around 1930.
Okay, so it was under him that the eugenics law was enforced.
He was a strong advocate of eugenics. And, you know, I don't know, we hold that, you know, I'm the historian. I mean, I try not to judge, and that was the cutting edge, but he was on the cutting edge of eugenics arguments.
Indiana was the only state first state that had it.
Yeah, and also, you know, I grew up with my dad constantly telling me that Nazi Germany had adopted their eugenics language almost directly from Indiana state law. And but the other things Hurdy did, city water systems, rudimentary city sewage collection systems. So it's one of those good things, bad things, and you just kind of got to weigh it all. The Monroe County death records, I just can't. The agreements that we will standardize causes of death, 1900 and then again in 1910, and you just find those things like ate too many green walnuts. Now, no one knows what that means. Nephritis is a big one, and that's a kidney failure. Bright's disease, yeah, and vapors, things like that. And I don't want to know what vapors are. I mean, and then when you try to track down these, what the living conditions were like, you get this outright refusal to standardize the language, the health language. If you go to a doctor now and he says, you've got strep throat, and you go to another doctor, he's going to say strep throat. If you went to 2 doctors in Monroe County in 1910, who knows what they would have told you, and who knows what they would have prescribed you. There just was no standardization. The reason of the newspapers is at that time, legal ads were a huge source of revenue, and you had to declare a political allegiance. So the Daily Telephone, or the Bloomington Telephone, which is now the Herald Times, is still listed as a Republican newspaper for the purpose of receiving legal ads. The Evening World was Oscar Craven's setting up, to get Democrats some of that money, because if there's a Democrat and Republican newspaper, you have to give to both of them. And then the Weekly Star, same thing, it was a Democrat weekly, and that's where your real revenue came from, was from legal advertising. I'm a township trustee, we still do legal advertising, and I'm one of those odd people that read them. You know, I especially like the ones the pawn shops put up. They have to legally advertise they're gonna sell something. But this competition, again, they would literally hear a rumor and stop the presses. Best example, the Telephone had huge headlines around 1910 for a race riot in Huron. If you've ever been to Huron, it's west of Bedford and it's a railroad crossing. That's it. And the call by Bradfute was to organize a militia in Bloomington and go down there to put down the race riot. And a train left Bloomington and then turned around when they got the telegram that it was a poker game that had both black work crews and white work crew members, and they had gotten in a fight over who really won the pot. And so that call went out, and the next day the true story was a couple inches of text. But that competition between those two newspapers makes it very hard to get anything nailed down, in particular looking for cases of the flu. They also saw themselves as public boosters, and it was really hard for the newspapers to print anything negative about Bloomington because Nashville was their peer at the time, and Bloomfield. And if you printed negative things about Bloomington, it was afraid those two towns would get the next Sears, whatever. It wasn't Sears, but the personal attacks, we just don't see them anymore like that. And one of the things that's really clear about the infrastructure too is that the students, when they got sick, left town. They left town and they went home to die. So it's really hard getting mortality statistics for Monroe County because so many people were carried to the hospital on stretchers. Carried to the train station on stretchers. And typhoid fever. Typhoid fever is salmonella. It's a variety of salmonella. And it comes with a variety of symptoms. But it was extremely common. I heard, as part of oral history in Harrodsburg, when I was growing up, that the high school used to be in Harrodsburg, that Smithville parents came over and burned it down because there was typhoid fever in the town well. And they burned the high school down, and it was rebuilt in Smithville where the well water was not contaminated. But it was a killer. One of the reasons our beards disappeared, if you look at Civil War and everyone's got beards, was because women refused to kiss men because the beard was where germs were, and they were matted, they were very dirty. And the germ theory is really what came in and not only raised women's headlines, but we ended public displays of affection and things of that nature. And this actually is a just standard newspaper ad. This one came out of a newspaper, Mishawaka, but they were printed like this in Monroe County. It was just a standard health warning. And typhoid comes in early spring, rains wash waste. They knew by this time the germ theory had came into being, that germs caused it. And it was just, it was a hazard of living. And how to avoid it. One of the big theories was flies spread typhoid fever. That these open cesspools that were all over Bloomington, the flies would conglomerate on them and then fly and come into the restaurants and the kitchens. And they would land on the food and their little feet would track in the germs. And that's when war on flies came about, is typhoid fever. Before that, they were just a nuisance of getting in your mouth and things like that. But it's still not resolved if flies carry typhoid fever on their feet. Because, well, just because it's so hard to prove. But prevention, we've got to decapitate typhoid. And this, most basic things, Typhoid Mary, I assume most of us have heard of Typhoid Mary. She was asymptomatic. She had no symptoms of typhoid fever. Typhoid fever lodges in your gallbladder, which is kind of an odd place for it to be. And so you're an active carrier forever once it's there. Typhoid Mary was a woman who cooked for rich families in New York. And she had no symptoms of typhoid fever, but everybody that she cooked for kept getting sick. And finally someone put it together that she was the one constant, and this helped prove the germ theory of typhoid fever, but it ended up with her being literally incarcerated for 20 years without a trial because she would not quit cooking, because she did not have the symptoms herself. And Mary Mallon's her name, but Typhoid Mary was a term I heard regular when we were growing up, because it was that famous, that breakthrough. And Bloomington had, when you go back through the health bulletins, Bloomington had reported about 20 cases of typhoid a year from 1900 on. And the reason in 1905 it was called an epidemic was IU students started getting it. People coming here from out of town, we send our best down to you, take care of them. Now we take care of them at the corner of Dunn and Kirkwood in that big bar. But the typhoid fever was a big concern because we were on well water and they were just starting to understand how it spread. And Smithville never got it though. I grew up in Harrodsburg, and there was an intense rivalry, Smithville and Harrodsburg. And Smithville's great claim when I was in Harrodsburg grade school was they never had typhoid fever. Well, that's wonderful. Internationally and nationally, the greatest killer in wars up until and through the Great War was typhoid fever, which is salmonella that lives in human waste. The flu turned into the biggest killer and passed typhoid fever there, and then public water supplies lessened it. So by World War II, there were actually more people that were being killed in combat than were dying of typhoid fever. And typhoid fever is not typhus. Typhoid, United States, we've had very few cases of typhus. Typhoid fever is salmonella in water. And when you have it, the two symptoms are either constipation or dysentery. You know, that covers a lot of turf. So eventually you break out with a rash on your chest, and that's how it was ultimately diagnosed. But we'll go through a little bit of this outbreak in 1910 because I'm sure you've all heard all your lives that Indianapolis threatened to remove Indiana University from Bloomington because of the water. And that's what this was a fight over water. And this was serialized in the Bloomington papers. The serialization of extended writing was a regularity. In the Indianapolis papers and in the Chicago papers, I've seen this same picture. And it's the story of Typhoid Mary. And it's actually a public caution story that when you read it, you find yourself educated about how not to get typhoid. And I pretty much guarantee you none of us want typhoid.
Question about typhoid.
Yeah,
You say it's carried in the gallbladder.
it resides in the gallbladder.
with modern antibiotics, can we kill the?
It's very easy to kill with modern antibiotics. There's still about 200 cases a year. I stay up on it because I'm into diseases. There's about 200 cases a year in the United States. The last one that hit epidemic proportions was in the late 1970s on the banks of the Mississippi around Arkansas. And it was kids swimming in the water, and the water was polluted. So, but it's salmonella, you know, the same stuff that gets you on picnics. The typhoid, you get these cherry red eruptions. You get either constipation or diarrhea. That makes it very hard to diagnose until you get these big cherry spots on you. A vaccine was developed in 1896. You're all aware of the pushback now on vaccines, the anti-vaccination crusades. Those have been happening since vaccinations came into being, since the first smallpox inoculations. And it's still not effective. If you go to Africa, I do believe you have to have a typhoid shot to get your visa for most African countries still. They don't want Americans going over there and getting sick and overtaxing what health systems they have. It's still very active. There's 145,000 deaths in 2015 around the world from typhoid fever. Chlorinated water really helped. Without medication, 30 to 70% of the people die, and obviously in 1910, they didn't have medication. They did. Grinding up wood charcoal was one of the remedies, is grind up wood charcoal, mix it in water and drink it. And the thing about these home remedies, though, is they're self-proving. If you got better for whatever reason, it worked. And if you died, we didn't get to it in time. So, you get into the death records and you try to track this stuff down, and then you get into the health records and try to track this stuff down in that period. It's all just kind of voodoo. The dog days are coming. The dog days were, this is the Weekly Star. Dog days are when you get stomach flux, and that makes absolute perfect sense. Shallow wells, temperatures of 90 to 100 degrees is just the perfect breeding of bacteria, and typhoid is a bacteria. And this is very early, although they're not reporting typhoid deaths in Monroe County in the paper at this time. They're warning people that the summer flux, that was another name of it, that it was around. So after you read hundreds of these newspapers, you start kind of interpreting the language. And kids were at school and, don't go places. And make sure your drinking water is pure, but I don't know how you did that. Here are 2 deaths of summer complaint in August. These are 4 days, 5 days after that previous article about the dog days of August are coming. A 15-month-old girl died of summer complaint. And this is an 18-month-old boy died of summer complaint in Bloomington. If I had to guess, I would guess there's typhoid involved there, possibly before the cherries break out, so there wasn't that identification, but they got far enough along to have the symptoms. What happens is it attacks your bowels too, and it softens what's already consistent. Your bowels are the consistency of, I know you just ate, but your bowels are the consistency of wet cardboard. And then typhoid germ attacks those bowels and takes the lining off. And you get perforations and then septicemia, body infections. It's a really horrible way to go. And again, the infant mortality rate in Monroe County in 1910 was over 100 babies out of every 1,000 died before their 5th birthday. That's an incredibly high rate. Afghanistan right now is the highest in the world. It's 147. So, you know, we were right up there with inter-Africa, things of that nature. The flies, kill flies, and this is where fly strips come from, fly swatters, those, and I know you've all seen them, the pumpers that have the little tank and that chemical smell. My dad hosed us with that stuff in Harrodsburg. I mean, that was it. Is there were just too many flies to do anything about, and everybody had failing septic systems, so he was really worried about that contamination. But I just never forget that smell, yes.
Now, you're talking about Monroe County, but throughout Indiana, did towns have similar problems?
Yes.
Or Bloomington was a little worse?
Bloomington was a little worse because we had more people. We had IU students, our best and brightest and richest. And so the parents from around the state were very concerned, but everywhere had this. Actually, the people who drank from the rivers, there's studies from that period, and I didn't get them because it didn't really, wasn't something I could fit into this, but river towns that got their water from river towns, from rivers, were much better off than towns that got theirs from wells, because we've always covered up our body waste. That's just something we've done forever. Dig a little cat hole, throw something on it, and then as soon as it rains, that starts permeating the groundwater. But typhoid's biggest spreader around here was the groundwater. There wasn't really a public water distribution system. There were tankers that came in on the Monon, and you would go down to where Showers is and with your buckets and stuff in times of drought and fill up. Yes? Yes?
Yeah, they just found the U.S. in Annapolis, and this don't relate, but I just kind of like to know. You know, a lot of people that survived the first deal, the torpedo in the Annapolis, they died from drinking salt water. You know, a lot of them floated in the ocean, you know. How did that salt, did they get a disease? They
No,
died from that salt water.
Yeah, it has to do with this a chloride overdose, and I'm not really sure. I know the wells in Harrodsburg, at 140 foot down, there is a salt aquifer. After you get through the really shallow freshwater, go another 50, 60 feet, and you hit a saltwater aquifer. And a lot of the kids I grew up with they had to go. Harrodsburg still has 2 pumps, town wells, and those kids had to go get their drinking water at the town wells and take them home, because you took a bath or you took showers and did the dishes in the salt water. Salt water, I'm not real clear on the physiology of it, but it somehow throws the metabolites in you out of.
Thank you.
But the fly, an enemy of mankind. If you ever go to IU or go online for those public health bulletins, they have the most lurid, frightening stories of flies that you've ever read. The enemy of mankind. And even Mark Twain got in on it. He did a short story on, if God is benevolent, why did he invent the fly? And that was a common discussion of why do we have flies? And I'm not really sure. But everybody was aware you could die really quickly. 70% chance of dying is not one I'd really like to have. I faced a 20% once and didn't sleep for 3 days until they told me, oh, you don't have that. Here was just one we wander off on. Other things to worry about, snakes in Brown County. This is the other thing our local newspapers did, was try to give the other communities around us black eyes. This is a story about a man killing copperheads in Brown County, 5 foot long. I don't know that I've ever seen a copperhead 5 foot long. And then down on the the county line with Lawrence County, what's now Hoosier National Forest, a man killed 5 great rattlesnakes and let 7 go. But there were things to take your mind off typhoid, and one of them was don't go out in the woods. But this snakes in brown, the idea was we're in competition with Nashville, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that they don't get any good press. They 8-4, and even though, I mean, these were all the local articles on the people dying from typhoid. So, you know, you didn't talk about it. It would damage your community's business prospects if you talked about sickness. And the first thing is Dr. Lyons, the city chemist, declared what city water there was free of typhoid. Celebrate, drink all of it you want. I don't know that I would believe that now, but there just weren't any options. And then a second one, the university water, which came from a lake out by the golf course off of the bypass, that water didn't have typhoid in it either. So if the city water didn't have typhoid and the university water didn't have typhoid, where is the typhoid coming from? And this epidemic, they called it, but it was really IU students were getting typhoid. And IU is our bread and butter. Let's see, we've had scares, health scares since I've been around, flus, meningitis, things like that, where people pull their kids out of IU. That hurts Bloomington, you know, business before health. And a stricken family. This family is on a roll. This is the city clerk. His wife gets typhoid. You know, this is the cream of our society starting to get this disease of dirtiness. You know, Teddy Roosevelt's mother painted the inside of her, she was hypochondriac. She painted the inside of her mansion brilliant white so she could see any dirt on the walls. She wore white shoes, stockings, dress, and gloves every waking moment. And then she died of typhoid. And the word was she had died of embarrassment because she got this disease of poverty. Yes?
You know, the tragedy for Teddy Roosevelt is his mother and his wife both died on the same day.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
They-
And he never talked about politics.
well,
Good hearing.
that Teddy Roosevelt's wife and mother died on the same day. I wonder if that's typhoid. I haven't,
In the same house.
in the same house, then it must have been typhoid.
Yes.
The contagiousness of it is still up in the air. Can you get it from really close contact, or does it take actual physical ingestion? But I just remember that died of embarrassment because she had got a disease of poverty. And if you look at diseases and the history of diseases, until the great influenza, disease was a personal responsibility. If you got typhoid, that was your fault. You need to do something. If you got smallpox, that's your fault. You need to do something. And what was different about the influenza was everybody got it. And so there were massive closings and everything. But when there were diseases of the individual poor person, there just wasn't much they were going to do. There's a great quote that I got coming up about Bucktown. And Harvey Pryor, 26-year-old man, now we're starting to get to the meat, had a business up around the square. White guy, successful, had a wife, kids on the way, died of typhoid. How did that happen? Germs like this, diseases like this only happen to the filthy. And I don't even know, is the Pryor family still around in Bloomington? This says established family. But Harvey Pryor died.
There are friars alive in the Bloomington area.
There are a lot.
There are friars alive in the Bloomington
Well, that's one of the reasons this death records thing is still being held close, is because there's so many family names there. And, but this is a white businessman, and this makes it very much different than the normal run-of-the-mill who get typhoid. And this is an advertisement. My mom, I had 7 brothers and sisters in Harrodsburg, and my mom and my grandmother, more kids than Carter's got liver pills. More kids than Carter's got liver pill. More whatever than Carter's got liver pills. And they came in little metal aspirin kind of boxes that flipped open. And this advertisement is selling Carter's little liver pills as a cure for typhoid. These are self-fulfilling events. If you take Carter's little liver pills and you live through typhoid, it worked. And if you die, didn't get them soon enough. And but there's every epidemic that came through back in this period, there was someone making a buck off of it, which is the name of what we do. And Harrison Hoover, he's an IU student. This is when it starts getting serious. IU students are dying of diseases of filth. Well, how do we fix that? Well, let's get the kids out of Bloomington. What happens if the kids get out of Bloomington? Well, you can get in a Chinese buffet whenever you want. But this is a huge threat to the Bloomington economy, that IU students are getting sick. And so Dr. Hurdy sent his chief epidemiologist down to Bloomington to track, why are people getting sick and dying of typhoid in Bloomington? And again, this is the Evening World at that same time telling us that, well, other cities have this too. We're all right. You know, typhoid is everywhere. One of the best quotes that I've got is from a doctor in Greene County who was of that old school, who learned apprentice, and he was being replaced by a woman. I can get the site, but he wrote to her that she might have a problem being the physician in Greene County because it took 8 good typhoid wells to support a family. And Bloomfield had got city water. So they were wrecking her chances of being a successful physician. And, but as much as you could, these were economic development issues. And now this one is a lie nailed. The typhoid fever epidemic in Bloomington, it is rumored, has assumed a severe nature, and a citizen of that city says papers of the disease are suppressing reports of new cases. That's what appeared in the Nashville paper, that they're lying about how nasty it is in Bloomington. And then this is Oscar Craven, who was the publisher of the Star. This is his personal rebuttal, is that it's false but ridiculous. Even though people are dying of typhoid in Monroe County, we don't want to let Nashville know that, because if somebody's going to locate a business, we want it here in Bloomington. And the official report of epidemic diseases is published. Well, that goes back to, if they wrote down it was typhoid fever, it would show up. But if they called it something else, stomach flux, indigestion, if you died before you got the telltale rash, we didn't declare it typhoid. That was going to be bad for business. This is from the State Board of Health report, and why it's interesting, and I'll point. No, I'll go up. This is Walnut Street. This is Kirkwood. This is 6th Street, so this is the square. And right here, I couldn't get this to color. Right here is an A, and right here is an A. Those were open cesspools when the state health officer got down here. Those were open cesspools, and all of the IU students who got typhoid had eaten at this hotel or this lunch counter here. And Well, it must be we found out what is causing it, except these are the businesses of Bloomington. So after the health officer is there, they immediately pumped those out. And I don't know how to describe a cesspool to you, something experiential that you've had. But if you go to a national park or you're out driving and there's a pit toilet instead of a flush toilet in the rest park, that is a cesspool. And yes,
So the hotel lunch counter was in the area of what used to be Workingman's?
just north of that alley.
On the outlets, Southern Sporting Goods.
West, excuse me. Here's Washington. So, yeah, you're right. It's right there on the,
General area.
and we'll come back to that in a little bit because those open cesspits, there weren't sewers. And the way of doing it was you just built a vault. And I know all of you from Bloomington have heard somebody say, oh, that's so-and-so. You know, they have an old cistern in their yard. No, I got news for you. That's not a cistern. That is a vault for holding raw sewage. And theoretically, somebody was going to come and pump it into a wagon, if you can imagine that, and haul it down and dump it into Clear Creek.
Called honey dippers.
Honey dippers, the honey wagons, and we had honey wagons when I was a kid. But the one thing that they got for sure was that all of the victims had eaten here. And back then they weren't called patients, they were called victims. But still yet, wait a minute, we're going to condemn the businesses in downtown Bloomington, and IU students won't want to come to Bloomington. This is the report from the county health officer in the discovery of those 2 open cesspools, although it really wasn't a discovery, all of them were open. There are only 11 cases among the white people and 5 among the colored. There are only 11 real cases. There are only 11 real cases. Well, how many white people have it? 11. How many black people have it? They don't count. And the many threatened cases of typhoid are not typhoid at all. This is fighting back to the black eye that Bloomington was getting. The students were coming here and getting sick. That's really just, when I read that, and that's 80% of the language I took out. I should have written sick, but I took out just a little bit of that sentence. There's 5 among the colored, which that 5 among the colored, which is their natural state, is the words I took out. And the diseases were diseases of poverty, and nobody was poorer in Bloomington than the African Americans. But this will all tie together. The African Americans, the poor African Americans at the time, lived between Lincoln and Indiana instead of out on the west side. The true slum was 10th Street in that area, and I've got a map of that that'll come up here in a second. So Dr. Hurdy, again, this guy is amazing. There's a book, it's available on Amazon for $30 called Who's Your Health Officer? And it's really a history of health in Indiana, and Hurdy's who changed it around. And so Dr. Hurdy, he came down personally. We're going to fix IU. We're going to get everything under control. Now, Dr. Hurdy is who put the green dye in the well. There were 2 Negroes who had contacted the disease, living in a rooming house not connected to any sewer, with open and overflowing cesspits. The general sanitary conditions were very bad. These pits were just filled in and buried within 24 hours, and that ended the IU cases. Now, why is that interesting? Because the cases in the county just kept right on going. When you get to the data of reported, well, let's go here. This is the Sanborn fire map, and I don't know if you're familiar with them. this is how fire rates used to be established. As there were maps of all cities made with buildings, you'd figure out density of buildings, could figure out where to put the fire stations and how much to charge them in fire levy. This is Kirkwood. That up there is 10th Street. This is Walnut Street. This is Dunn right in here. Yeah, or Grant, excuse me. And this is the core of what was called Bucktown. This is, it was originally the Showers Brothers lumber yard. In the 1870s, the railroad work crews got to Bloomington on what's now the Illinois Central, the Indiana Railroad line, and they let them all go. They were blacks and Italians, and the lumberyard had moved to Showers down on the levee. This was open, and it became a squatting settlement, just really poor people moving in. This is McCullough School, and up there would be Yogi's. But if you look at this, you have the big houses, and then in the back you have these little structures. And at first, I thought these were sheds. And then the more I read about life in Bucktown, these are dwellings. These are little hovels just dug into the ground with a roof over them. And this is what's Bucktown. IU purchased it in 1920 and cut a sweetheart deal with a developer to get this developed and taken out. As you go east on 10th Street from Washington, you're going down a hill, and then you start coming back up a hill. That's right in here. That was both the sewer, that drainage way was the sewer, and it was the drinking water for this. And they had a pool hall, they had a grocery store, there was a church in there, and it was, you've really got to dig to find references to it. Elizabeth Bridgewater's wrote her autobiography. She said it was not a nice place. Clarence Gilliam made reference to it that it was a slum. I found newspaper articles. The one that really stuck in my head was a guy got drunk and spent the night, because it was a little mecca of sin too. The guy got drunk and spent the night in one of those little dugouts and froze his feet off, even though he was indoors. And so when they filled in the empty cesspits there, suddenly the black community was responsible for the typhoid, although the one constant was everybody had eaten at that restaurant on Kirkwood. It was just laid the whole thing off on the African American community. And again, the records, there had been 13 IU students reported to the Board of Health. Burton Meyer's History of Indiana University, he says there were more than 20 and 3 students dead. The newspaper had 1 student dead. I believe the other 2 had gone home to be sick, because the death certificate records don't show it either. But then okay, before we get out of it, but this is how disease was looked upon. It was a disease of the individual. Diseases were caused by filth, and in particular, they were caused by minorities. In smallpox, there's a slide. So after they filled in that, it went away. There were, again, about another 15 deaths in Monroe County from typhoid, but that didn't count because it wasn't students. And those were out in the county. My mother's well, even as an adult, when I would drink iced tea from her house, I would get very serious bowel issues. And so, Monroe County itself was even worse than the city. But if the students aren't dying, we're making a buck. Then, 7 years later, another disease of poverty shows up, smallpox. And this is part of a national epidemic. And just the juxtaposition, this is how they came out of smallpox, 26 cases in Bloomington. Sounds fairly severe. Of equal importance is someone had a tooth extracted and they died. You know, so deflect away, and that's really common. Juxtaposition is how you arrange the news articles, and that's really common how Brad Fute and Cravens did it. If you had bad news, put something worse next to it. It's also known as the Friday evening news dump in Washington, D.C., because if you just dump it on Friday evening, no one will notice. Okay, and that slide was out of order, I'm sorry. The clincher on the big push on typhoid is 1909, 1910, never the same number of typhoid deaths in Monroe County according to the death certificate. There were fewer of dysentery or diarrhea. Cholera infantum, which was uncontrolled diarrhea of infants. It happened mainly when you shifted them from mother's milk to cow's milk or to water because you got so many pollutants. And this is why Pepto-Bismol was invented, was to get the uncontrollable water diarrheas under control. Then other intestinal, but you add it all together, and there were actually more people that died of intestinal disorders in 1909 than 1910 when Bloomington was labeled as having this typhoid epidemic. So was it an epidemic? Maybe not, but it did some serious damage to the IU community. I know you've all heard IU threaten time and time again to pull the university out because of the water supplies. Yeah, the lack of water was only part of it. The bad nature of our water was the other part of it, is you could die from drinking it. That's just one of my favorites. Everything still goes on. The smallpox is going on. This is a shot at Bucktown. 12-year-old boy found drunk, delirious, in the northeast corner of the city, which is Bucktown. And they don't tell you that because they had some, Bucktown's really a very racist name. There's just nothing else to call it. He wore short pants. He was a pitiful sight. And these are all commonality. It's a way of diminishing people without saying these people are not worthy of humanity. He lived. The smallpox. Oh man, I love me some good diseases. Hey, I've always been fascinated by these things. Monkeypox, cowpox, if you remember your high school history, the women in England, the milkmaids, didn't have smallpox scars on their hands because they milked cows and they would get cowpox and then they wouldn't get smallpox, so their faces weren't scarred. If you look Queen Victoria time, the women wore veils. That's because their faces were generally scarred from smallpox. It mutated 1860 to 1880 from variola major to variola minor and went from a mortality rate of, I don't know if I have it up there, around 30%, and it went down to less than 1%. It didn't kill you, it just left you with horrific scars. And again, and the other names, and this is straight out of Wiki, the other names for it, white pox, okay, that's us, but then Kaffir pox.
That's a racist name.
That's a racist name. Cuban itch, that's a racist name. West Indian pox, that's a racist name. You know, even then, smallpox vaccines and intubation, what's the word, smallpox vaccine had been around for over 150 years, but it's still being blamed on poor people because of the 6 common names. 3 of them are very much related to specific ethnicities. And these are out of Bloomington records, too. Those names pop up in those death record. Smallpox, how's it spread? Well, it's just highly contagious through coughing, touch, shared clothing. There's all sorts of legends about people giving infected blankets to Native Americans. There's only 2 instances of that have been documented. One of them was by the British, and the other was an American trading post in North Dakota. But because it had left your body, did not kill the virus. And 1980, it was eradicated, and I would almost bet you all still have your little round scar on your shoulder because that was what they gave us. And I was in the military in mid-1970s, and I got smallpox vaccines all over again. I was a medic, so I gave them. And there was no smallpox in the United States. The big fear is it's going to resurface, and that even those of us who are vaccinated don't have the immunity from those. We don't think it's controversial, but we know if you read the papers and publications, there's an anti-vaccination push now. People don't want vaccinations. This push is not new. Vaccinating for smallpox, which is a horrible disease of disfigurement and death, has been resisted. Cotton Mathers had to force it on Massachusetts back in the 1600s, early 1700s. This is the city. Smallpox is going around, and they were ordering kids to get a smallpox vaccine before they went to school. Except if you follow the numbers through this, you end up with about 200 kids that aren't getting vaccinated because nobody would pay for the vaccines. And that is still a debate. Who pays for our general health? Do we pay for people who can't afford it? You know, do they pay themselves? The parents who refuse to get their children vaccinated, well, what if their children give it to somebody who can't afford the vaccine? And right next to it is the Russian Civil War. And those two things, this smallpox epidemic has pretty much been traced to the Great War. But tetanus germs in the smallpox vaccine. This is, I read an article last night, mercury in the flu vaccines. It is the classic argument that you find in folklore. It just keeps coming up in different things. So it's up here that if you get your smallpox vaccine, you may get tetanus. And there's a general rule in life, don't get tetanus, lockjaw. So even though we think things are new, they're not new at all. My Yahoo, is that it? November 16, they're admitting 26 cases of smallpox. This is setting up a conflict in the city of Bloomington. The health officer orders quarantines, but who takes care of those people while they're in quarantine? The health officer has no money. The township trustees are saying, wait a minute, you can't quarantine the whole town and expect us to pay for it. Nobody has any money. Becomes an incredibly complicated scenario. And then at the same time, death from an extracted tooth. You got to keep distracting people. You get these contradictory messages. As 200 high school students have been vaccinated, surely that's going to do something good for us. But a week later, there's 6 new cases of smallpox. Keep reporting it's going away, and eventually you'll be right. And the economy won't be. 18 cases in the city. They just didn't count them in the county. Again, another notice to vaccinate if you can afford it. Who's going to pay for it if you can't afford it? Now we've gotten serious. This is just 6 days after 6 new cases. It's an epidemic in a serious stage. 21 families for a total of 60 cases. And if you think about this, 21 families locked into their homes. No one can go in, no one can go out. How do you feed people? And the township trustees are notoriously tight-fisted now. And they weren't interested in the city declaring people wards of the state, because that's effectively what turned into a huge power struggle. And it went to the Indiana Supreme Court. The good sense politics of smallpox, don't close the schools. Even those kids that aren't inoculated will be much healthier if you just keep them busy. Because the attitude was poverty and laziness was the primary cause of disease, and these other things weren't necessarily the things you wanted to worry about. They did not close the schools. We're up to 200 cases. They didn't, smallpox. Didn't close the schools, didn't close the churches. It was up to the individuals to go get their vaccination. Again, no new smallpox cases. The next day that epidemic is serious was the 26th, the 27th. There's no new smallpox cases, and this notice to vaccinate showed every day in both papers. Now, vaccination for children, the school board decided to pay for the kids. Became incredibly contentious. We're down to one new case, 1,800 of the 2,100 in the city school system were vaccinated. What happened to the 300? It never says. I mean, covering disease and public health wasn't what they want to do. Yes?
Could they have not possibly already had smallpox, therefore they wouldn't need the vaccination?
They wouldn't have needed it if they had it, but there hadn't been that many. Kids were the ones who died from it. There hadn't been that many cases reported yet. The to vaccinate at public expense has been a huge debate ever since George Washington required his army to get vaccinated for smallpox. Why should we pay for poor people to get vaccinated? It's really, diseases are a class issue even today. Who gets AIDS? We all know if an answer popped into your head. We tend to associate diseases with class. Who got Ebola? Poor people in Africa, wasn't us. But we kept poor people from Africa out of the country. Vaccination, we're going to do it. And also, this is the school board. It's a report that the city's trying to open a new pest house, a new pestilence hospital, but they can't find anyone that'll rent to them. Which, and I'm pretty sure you've probably heard, people and their knowledge of diseases, periodically you hear a report that in England there will be a basement uncovered that still has bubonic plague germs in the wet cellars and things. I see those regularly. There was a great fear that if you rented to a pest house, that your property would become totally worthless. Bloomington had a pest house. It was behind Templeton School. And one of the neat things about that was there was a spring farther up in Bryan Park that the city closed because of mercury in the spring. And the mercury came from people in the pest house, smallpox, who were being treated with mercury. And when they went to the bathroom, into the cesspool that overflowed and eventually drained into the groundwater and then bubbled up in the spring, the mercury that was being used as medicine in the pest house was in the drinking water. That spring is still there, covered up. I've never been able to find it, and I've walked up through there. But you know, it's not, none of this stuff has been resolved about that conflict of class and who pays for sickness when no one else can. Well, national health care, that's our issue still. Notice school patrons, your kid can't come to school unless you get them vaccinated. Not unless the school vaccinate them, but unless you get them vaccinated. So if you don't have any money, and we have places like Bucktown where there is no money, then we're mice on a treadmill. Whole family has smallpox. This is the only accounting I could find. It's in Polk Township. But just to let you know, things are still better in Monroe County. They add in that, in Bloomington, they add in, well, there's smallpox in Polk Township, so you don't want to go there, but really don't go to Ellisville because there's scarlet fever and diphtheria over there. As you're better off staying in Bloomington and spending your money here. This is, people want to help. This is a letter to the editor, how to cure smallpox without scars. Go into your spice cabinet and get your cream of tartar, put it in a glass of water, stir it up and drink it. It'll cure smallpox, and you won't scar. I don't know if that's true, but if I recall, cream of tartar is incredibly bitter, so it tastes like medicine. And special notice to all township trustees, the county poor farm. You cannot send anybody to the poor farm unless you pay for their vaccination before they get there. So again, they're throwing it off on the, anyone pay for it but the city of Bloomington. And there's a good report at the asylum. And now when I was researching the poorhouse aspect of it, and I didn't know, I mean, I think we all know that Cars Park was the poor farm and that the bed and breakfast across the road was the poorhouse. But that's the new one. The original poor farm was off the Bloomington to Ellisville Road on the south side. There was about 160 acres there. That was the original poor farm, and shows up on the 1856 property maps. But getting sick in this period probably wasn't real good for anybody. City council meets and they boast that they were able to take care of each person with smallpox for 10 cents a day. That's to buy them food, fuel, clothing, things that they need in quarantine or in the pest house. And meanwhile, stealing chickens gets you put in jail. And that still was something when I was a kid. People would get arrested for stealing chickens. And groceries and coal. Now, the poorhouse, not the poorhouse, the pest houses were not medical facilities. The hospital wasn't really a medical facility. The hospital was where you went to die. The pest houses, they hired normally a man and a woman, or a man and his wife, to keep the fires going and to serve a basic 3 meals a day. And if they gave any kind of care, that was unusual. The one behind Templeton during this period was used for women. And it was out in the country. The city ended up back up around Maxwell or First Street, and behind Templeton was countryside. And the reason it was countryside was the vapors coming off of the sick people couldn't infect people like they were in the city. Here's the real concern. Smallpox cost the city $5,000 so far. What would it have cost them had they done nothing? Never became an issue. This is in the city council minutes as just a small thing in passing. City council minutes are also one of those archives I recommend you go read just for a good laugh every now and then. And the argument was Do we take one member of the family and put them in the pest houses, or do we take the whole family and quarantine? The real fear, it gets in the jails. Now the criminal element has it. What do you do if smallpox gets in the jails? Who's going to pay for those guys? Taxpayers? You don't got to, but if you understand the economy of property taxes back then, we were an incredibly cash poor society. Property taxes were the most brutal way of impoverishing people there were, because they were assessed at an equal rate. People didn't have money. If you took their money, then they were left with nothing. And how do we fund county government? How do we fund police protection, public health? Should we have public health or should we have individual health? Public health has always been controversial, in particular in funding. And then at the same time, going back to the dirty alleyways, in 1918, April 12, a voluntary cleanup day for the streets and alleys of Bloomington. At the same time, this ran, and I couldn't do it because I lost my computer stuff in a crash on Friday, but there was a declaration of enforcement of the loose pig ordinance in Bloomington. The police declared it a priority to round up all loose hogs in the city of Bloomington. Too many people were letting them free range in the garbage in the alleyways. But, you know, they want to clean up manure piles and install fly-proof manure. And the city let it go on for a month in this buildup, and somebody then said, well, who's going to haul all this stuff off? And the city said, well, not us, we're paying for smallpox. And this went on for a bit, and then even though this ad ran every week, twice a week, the city adamantly, the city council refused to pay for the cleanup, and it never happened. One of the alleyways on Walnut and 7th Street, I don't know whether it's to the east of the square or to the west, Walnut and 7th Street, the alleyway was closed by horse manure in downtown Bloomington. And that was their poster child for why the government should get involved. The government wouldn't get involved. And then here it is, I'm a township trustee. The State Board of Accounts ordered that the city could indeed quarantine people and put them into pest houses, and that townships had to pay for it. This is immediately after the state Supreme Court ruled that if the city quarantined people or the city put them in pest houses, the city had to pay for that care. And the city of Bloomington just did not care that the Supreme Court was ordering them to take care. They said, no, we're not going to do it anymore. So townships became the primary method of funding health at that point in time. And again, let's deflect it. There's smallpox over in Bloomfield, excuse me. It's not just us. It's over there. And this is just one of those random ads that jumped out at me. Yes. And we think this might be a little straightforward for an ad in a newspaper at those times. Has anyone noticed the plethora of new health ads that are appearing in the Herald Times? You don't need Viagra anymore. You don't need Rogaine. There's starting to be a lot of graphic health ads appearing in the Herald Times if you look. Much along this, that you can get rid of hemorrhoids without surgery. And so even though we think this is a little straightforward for the period, we still do it.
You got fake news now, I guess you're gonna have fake health again too.
Yeah, I guess so. But, you know, she does kind of look like she's experiencing discomfort. And I just repeated that one. Now, here is the real just of America. In March, after it's announced the city's paid $5,000, will we make smallpox vaccination compulsory? Does the government have the authority to tell you to get a shot? And this debate went on and on and on about how can government tell me to spend my own money? And again, the cleanup ads are showing up. But who is supposed to pay for vaccines? I mean that rhetorically. When I was in grade school in Harrodsburg, they lined us up and gave us a sugar cube so we wouldn't get polio. And the PTO had a huge debate about whether the township ought to pay for that polio vaccine. That seems kind of important now, but this, national health care, this debate has been going on eternally. And then the smallpox just went away. Well, it didn't just go away, but we got back to normal things. Curfew. How many of you were ever arrested for curfew? Oh my goodness. Twice. Once in September for Halloween vandalism. In September. But yeah, children and poverty. This is the only death of hundreds and hundreds of cases of smallpox in 1917, 1918. Gentleman, he was on a railroad work crew living in a boxcar out by Unionville, and he contracted smallpox. They brought him into the pest house, not to the hospital, to the pest house. And it was down around Winslow and Old Walnut Street Pike. They took him down there, and he kept getting worse. He asked for a particular woman in the house to come and pray with him. She came and prayed with him, and they say he got a look of bliss, and then he died before the next morning. But he was the only person that died in this whole thing. However, I've only surfed the articles and the minutes and things like that in this. This debate over public health has just gone on and on. And like everything, including the flu, which we won the state basketball championship right after the flu crested, smallpox, Ralph Easery, have you ever heard of him? I think I saw Bob Hamill's going to be here. Ask Bob. This was a Bloomington basketball player in 1917, took our mind off smallpox. Bloomington basketball player in 1917, which was really their good team, better than their 1918 team that won, 1919 team that won the state championship. Ralph Easery got the Gimbel Award. He was from Bloomington. The Gimbel Award is now the Trester Award for mental attitude and grades. And the second winner of that award was from Bloomington, and it gave us something to celebrate. The same day it's out, they finally published the legal notice that contains the language of the mandatory vaccine, that everybody is going to have to get these shots. Then there had been the death. They published the legal notice, we're going to make people get better, or people get their shots, and smallpox disappeared. So there were no mandatory vaccines adopted by the city of Bloomington, and we played a heck of a game of basketball. Yes?
I guess in epidemiology, you've got a certain number of people that are resistant, prevent the spread through the general population. Could it be that the minimal amount of vaccination took place before it did away with the smallpox epidemic?
Could it? Yeah. One of the things that's the mortality studies on the Civil War is, contrary to what you believe, country boys died of disease at much higher rates than the city boys, because the city boys had grown up in filth and sickness and in poverty, and they had already been exposed to everything. But when you got out into the country, they grew up not a lot of interchange among people, and they hadn't been exposed or built up any resistance to these diseases. So, you know, no one knows why diseases come and go. There's one thing that happens with diseases, it happened with the flu, they tend to mutate into a less lethal form. And it grants the virus or the bacteria some kind of human characteristic that it knows not to kill all of its host. But that puts too much on the virus. But in general, all viruses and bacteria mutate on themselves. And that kind of makes sense. The Ebola in Africa, at the end, what was that, 3 years ago, 2 years ago? The huge outbreak of Ebola in Africa. The people at the end weren't getting nearly as sick as the people at the beginning. And it's because the virulence of the virus had diminished. So who knows? The way that you find out, it's like how you find out if you're going to get cancer if you smoke. You just keep smoking. So will I get sick? Keep doing what you're doing. And now, again, this is one of those threads. Vault and cesspool cleaning, J.J. Shively. I know from following his ads, he was African American. Going back to Bucktown in 1903, and this is one of those things that we cover up, you may have been exposed to it. 1903, a Joe Shively was pulled out of Bucktown and taken to Dunmeadow, stripped, tied to a tree, and beaten with barbed wire by white cappers. White cappers. And this is J.J. Shively, and I've never been able to connect the two. But Joe Shively's crime was he had moved in with a white woman on the very edge of Bucktown. And actually, they took her first, stripped her and beat her with barbed wire. The city police showed up and turned away, just left. And then after they beat her with barbed wire, they went back and got Joe Shively, and J.J. Shively is still here, and his job, and he is an African American, his job is cleaning out those cesspools and cesspool's. Yes?
In the 1950s, Shively was the name of the dog catcher.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes?
You know, you're talking about the alley between 6th and 7th, closed by the nerve. In 1918, 1920, there was a livery stable right on the square. See, between 6th and 7th.
Do you know what side of the street it was on?
It was on the north side.
East or west though?
Was it,
Well, it's right on the square between Walnut and College.
had to be going back in toward the university because the North Square was developed by then. Hey, well, there you go, and they didn't worry about their byproducts.
No.
Hey, yeah, and I know you all get a little restless, but you know, this is why I love Monroe County history, is you make one connection, someone else can make another connection, and what we're talking about is not the history that shows up in that 1910 history book.
My dad worked at that livery station.
Really? You know, and now you're saying that, I think at the History Center, they have pictures of that and the hitch racks that are up there. I know somewhere in Bloomington, you could rent a horse, just like you rent cars. In the 1870s, it was very common if you need,
Worley Stables down in Washington.
just go rent a horse. James Wilkes Booth fled Washington on a rental horse. Okay. Well, there you go, Michael. I can go into the flu, or people are starting to, you know, it's up to you.
I'd say can you save the flu part for another day?
Oh, yeah, by then, I hope I have lots more diseases.
Yeah, we probably better call it.
Yeah, and, well, I hope I gave you a little bit of levity. Last time I was here, I got some really good advice, was don't tell too many jokes about these people, because to them, it was their life. And it has readjusted the way I think, even though it's incredibly odd that you drink mercury to get rid of a disease. I go to all the Lewis and Clark campsites. That's how they determine Lewis and Clark were at a certain site. They find the latrines and test them for mercury. They were called thunderclaps. The pills were called thunderclaps, and they were used to treat dysentery. And
Yeah, they used arsenic, you know, as a medicine.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate coming. And, just as a plug, and it's not for sale, the history of these 3 diseases is in the Indiana room at the library. I've donated all my research to them, and it's pretty good. This is actually the best paper I wrote. I just reread it and thought, my goodness, I was good. Okay, thank you.